Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on the website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 39, Ranchos, Chinese Americans, Genocide, and Uncle Tom's Cabin. Next rule of history: don't detach from your humanity. Anecdotal value refers to the primary social and political significance of stories or anecdotal evidence in advancing knowledge of a social, cultural, or economic phenomenon. While anecdotal evidence is generally unscientific, the evaluation of anecdotes has welcomed sustained academic scrutiny from economists and intellectuals in the last several decades. Academics seek to quantify the importance of the use of anecdotes. For example, consider the quote widely misattributed to Joseph Stalin: "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Here's a reasonably morbid exercise I have my students perform to help unshackle themselves from just reading the statistics of an event. Imagine one dead body. Imagine the toe tag, the white sheet over the corpse. Feel the stillness in the air. This is relatively easy to do, even to someone with the weakest of imaginations. Now imagine two bodies. Not too difficult here. Side by side in the morgue. Now 10. 10 bodies starts to change the room's smell, which is now full of bodies stacked on top like a ghastly pyramid. Now 100. Decaying bodies spill out of the room. Flies and stench of rot fill the air. Now 1,000. Now 10,000. Eventually, the number becomes too arduous to control. The vision and scope are lost in the sheer size of a problem. That is how we can sit like Hindu cows when we read an estimated 100,000 civilians died from the U.S. bombing of Tokyo in 1945. People are not numbers. We must remember that as we go through our textbooks, these anecdotal events are actual events that happened to actual people.
Ranchos. The Spanish and Mexican governments made many concessions and land grants in Alta California and Baja California from 1785 to 1846. Spanish government made the concessions of land to retired soldiers to induce them to remain on the frontier. These concessions reverted to the Spanish crown upon the death of the recipient. Later, the Mexican government encouraged settlement by issuing much larger land grants to native-born and naturalized Mexican citizens. The offerings were usually 2 or more square leagues or 35 square kilometers in size. Unlike Spanish concessions, Mexican land grants provided permanent, unencumbered ownership rights. Mexico granted most ranchos were located along the California coast around San Francisco Bay, inland along the Sacramento River, and within the San Joaquin Valley. When the government secularized the mission churches in 1833, they required that land be set aside for each neophyte family. But the Native Americans were quickly brushed aside by Californios who acquired the church lands as grants with the help of those in power. The indigenous peoples instead became virtual slaves of the rancheros. The Mexican-American War began on May 13, 1846, declaring war by the United States of America. Action in California started with the Bear Flag Revolt on June 15, 1846. On July 7, 1846, U.S. forces took possession of Monterey, the capital of California, and terminated the authority and jurisdiction of Mexican officials that day. Armed resistance ended in California with the Treaty of Cahuenga signed on January 13, 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the war, was signed on February 2, 1848, and California became a territory of the United States. Between 1847 and 1849, California was run by the U.S. military. A constitutional convention met in Monterey in September 1849 and set up a state government. It operated for 10 months before California was admitted to the Union as the 31st state by the United States Congress, as part of the Compromise of 1850, enacted on September 9, 1850. While the end of the 1840s saw the close of Mexican control over Alta California, this period also marked the beginning of the Rancheros' greatest prosperity. Cattle had been raised primarily for their hides and tallow, as there was no market for large quantities of beef, especially in the days before refrigeration, railroads, or ice production. Demand dramatically changed with the onset of the gold rush, as thousands of miners and other fortune seekers flooded into Northern California. These newcomers needed meat, and cattle prices soared with demand. The Rancheros enjoyed the halcyon days of Hispanic California. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo provided that the Mexican land grants would be honored. To investigate and confirm titles in California, American officials acquired the provincial records of the Spanish and Mexican governments in Monterrey. The new state's leaders soon discovered that the Mexican government had given several grants before the Americans gained control. The Mexican governors had rewarded faithful supporters and hoped to prevent the new immigrants from gaining control of the land. Sponsored by California Senator William M. Gwin, in 1851, Congress passed an act to ascertain and settle private land claims in the state of California. The act required all Spanish and Mexican land grants holders to present their titles for confirmation before the Board of California Land Commissioners. Contrary to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, this act placed the burden of proof of identification on landholders. Grantees were required to prove the validity of their received grants and establish their exact boundaries. The maps available were often hand-drawn and imprecise. The land had until the gold rush been of little value, and boundary locations were often quite vague, referring to an oak tree, a cow skull on a pile of rocks, a creek, and in some cases a mountain range. The 588 grants made by Spanish and Mexican authorities in California between 1769 and 1846 encompassed more than nearly 14,000 square miles. The settlement of land titles was frequently complicated and lengthy. Even in cases where the boundaries were more specific, many markers had been destroyed before surveyors could do accurate surveys. Aside from faint survey lines, the Land Commission had to determine whether the grantees had fulfilled the requirements of the Mexican colonization laws. Mexican officials often did not keep adequate records and sometimes did not provide grantees with any grant documentation. Many grants required additional approvals before they were legal, conditions of the grantees' necessary funding to live on the land. Settlers rarely fulfilled all of these requirements. While the Land Commission confirmed 604 of the 813 claims it reviewed, most decisions were appealed to U.S. District Court and some to the Supreme Court. The confirmation process required lawyers, translators, and surveyors and took an average of 17 years to resolve. It proved expensive for landholders to defend their titles through the court system. In many cases, they had to sell or give the title to a portion of their land to pay for defense fees or gave attorneys land instead of payment. Rejected Spanish and Mexican land claims resulted in conflicting claims by the grantees, squatters, and settlers seeking the same land. This resulted in pressure on Congress to change the rules. Under the Preemption Act of 1841, squatters could preempt others' claims to portions of the land and acquire clear title by paying $1.25 an acre for up to a maximum of 160 acres. Land from titles rejected by the courts became part of the public domain and available to homesteaders after the first Federal Homestead Act of 1862 was passed, allowing anyone to claim up to 160 acres. This resulted in additional pressure on Congress, and beginning with Ranchos in 1863, it passed unique acts that allowed certain claimants to preempt their land without regard to acreage. By 1866, this privilege was extended to all owners of rejected claims. Several ranchos remained in whole or in part in the sliver of the territory of Alta California left to Mexico by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which then became part of Baja California. Rancho Tijuana lost its claim to title to its land in San Diego County, but the Mexican government confirmed the balance of the rancho in the 1880s. Rancho El Rosario, Rancho Cueros de Venado, and Rancho Tecate were each granted to citizens of San Diego in the 1820s or 1830s and lay wholly in what is now Baja California, as was the Rancho San Antonio Abad, whose origin and the title is more obscure. Their titles were never subjected to dispute in U.S. courts. The rancheros became land-rich and cash-poor, and the burden of attempting to defend their claims was often financially overwhelming. Grantees lost their lands due to mortgage default, attorney fees payment, or other personal debts. The land was also lost as a result of fraud. A sharp decline in cattle prices, the floods of 1861, and droughts of 1863 also forced many of the overextended rancheros to sell their properties to Americans. They often quickly subdivided the land and sold it to new settlers, farming individual plots. A shift in the economic dominance of grain farming over cattle raising was marked by the passage of the California No-Fence Law of 1874. This repealed the Trespass Act of 1850, which had required farmers to protect their planted fields from free-ranging cattle. The repeal of the Trespass Act required that ranchers fence stock in rather than farmers fencing cattle out. The ranchers were faced with the high expense of fencing large grazing tracts or selling their cattle at ruinous prices. The ranchos established land use patterns that are still recognizable in contemporary California. Many communities still retain their Spanish rancho name. For example, Rancho Penasquitos, the first land grant by the Spanish in today's San Diego County, is now a suburb within San Diego. Modern communities often follow the original boundaries of the rancho, based on geographic features and abstract straight lines. Today, most of the initial rancho land grants have been dismantled and sold off to become suburbs and rural burbs. A minimal number of ranchos are still owned by descendants of the original owners, retain their original size, or remain undeveloped. Spain made about 30 concessions between 1784 and 1821, and Mexico issued about 270 land grants between 1833 and 1846. The ranchos established permanent land use patterns. The rancheros patterned themselves after the landed gentry of New Spain and were primarily devoted to raising cattle and sheep. Their workers included Native Americans who had learned Spanish while living at one of the former missions. The ranchos were often based on access to the resources necessary for raising cattle, such as grazing lands and water. The rancho boundaries became the basis for California's land survey system and are found on modern maps and land titles. Land development from that time forward has usually followed the boundaries of the ranchos, and many of their names are still in use. For example, Rancho San Diego is now an unincorporated rural burb east of San Diego, and Rancho Bernardo is a suburb in San Diego.
Chinese Americans. In the 19th century, Chinese-US maritime trade began the history of Chinese Americans. At first, only a handful of Chinese came, mainly as merchants or former sailors. The first Chinese people of this wave arrived in the United States around 1815. By 1852, there were 25,000, mostly from 6 districts of Guangdong Province, who wanted to make their fortune in the 1849-era California gold rush. However, the Chinese came for the gold rush in California, and built the first transcontinental railroad, worked southern plantations after the Civil War, and participated in establishing California agriculture and fisheries. Many were also fleeing the Taiping Rebellion that affected their region. From the outset, European Americans met them with the distrust and overt racism of settled European populations, ranging from massacres to pressuring Chinese migrants into what became known as Chinatowns. Chinese immigrants were far more imposed upon the government than most other ethnic minorities in these regions regarding their legal situation. Laws were made to restrict them, including exorbitant special taxes, prohibiting them from marrying white European partners to prevent men from marrying at all, increasing the population, and barring them from acquiring U.S. citizenship. Decrees by the Qing dynasty issued in 1712 and 1724 forbade emigration and overseas trade and were primarily intended to prevent remnant supporters of the Ming dynasty from establishing bases overseas. However, merchants widely ignored these decrees. Large-scale immigration of Chinese laborers began after China began to receive news of deposits of gold found in California. The Burlingame Treaty with the United States in 1868 effectively lifted any former restrictions, and large-scale immigration to the United States began. To avoid difficulties with departure, most Chinese gold seekers embarked on their trans-Pacific voyage from the docks of Hong Kong, an important trading port in the region. Less frequently, they left from the neighboring port of Macau, with the choice usually being decided by the distance of either city. Only merchants were able to take their wives and children overseas. The vast majority of Chinese immigrants were peasants, farmers, and artisans. Young men, usually married, left their wives and children behind since they intended to stay in America only temporarily. Wives also remained behind to fulfill their traditional obligation to care for their husbands' parents. The men sent a large part of their money in America back to China. Because it was usual at that time in China to live in confined social nets, families, unions, guilds, and sometimes whole village communities or even regions, sent nearly all of their young men to California. From the beginning of the California Gold Rush until 1882, when an American federal law ended the Chinese influx, approximately 300,000 Chinese arrived in the United States. Because the chances to earn more money were far better in America than in China, these migrants often remained considerably longer than they had planned initially, despite increasing xenophobia and hostility towards them. Chinese immigrants booked their passages on ships with the Pacific Mail Steamship Company and the Occidental and Oriental Steamship Company. Chinese immigrants mainly borrowed the money to fund their journey from relatives, district associations, or commercial lenders. In addition, American employers of Chinese laborers sent hiring agencies to China to pay for the Pacific voyage of those who were unable to borrow money. This credit ticket system meant that the funds advanced by the agencies to cover the cost of the passage were to be paid back by wages earned by the laborers later during their time in the US. Indentured migrants had long used the credit ticket system, from South China who left to work in the South Seas, the region to the south of China, including the Philippines, the former Dutch East Indies, the Malay Peninsula, and Borneo, Thailand, Indochina, and Burma. The Chinese who left for Australia also used the credit ticket system. The entry of the Chinese into the United States was, to begin with, legal and uncomplicated and even had a formal judicial basis in 1868, with the signing of the Burlingame Treaty between the United States and China. But there were differences compared with the policy for European immigrants. If the Chinese migrants had children born in the United States, those children would automatically acquire American citizenship. However, the immigrants themselves would legally remain as foreigners indefinitely. Unlike European immigrants, the government withheld the possibility of naturalization from the Chinese. Although the newcomers arrived in America after an already established small community of their compatriots, they experienced many culture shocks. The Chinese immigrants neither spoke nor understood English, and were not familiar with Western culture and life. They often came from rural China, and had difficulty adjusting to and finding their way around large towns such as San Francisco. The racism they experienced from the European Americans from the outset increased continuously until the turn of the 20th century and, with lasting effect, prevented their assimilation into mainstream American society. This, in turn, led to the creation, cohesion, and cooperation of many Chinese benevolent associations and institutions whose existence in the United States continued far into the 20th century as a necessity both for support and survival. Many other factors hindered their assimilation, most notably their appearance. Under Qing dynasty law, Han Chinese men were forced under the threat of beheading to follow Manchu customs, including shaving the front of their heads and combing the remaining hair into a queue. Historically, to the Manchus, the policy was both an act of submission and, in practical terms, an identification aid to tell friends from foe. Because Chinese immigrants returned as often to China to see their family, they could not cut off their often hated braids in America, and then legally re-enter China. The first Chinese immigrants usually remained faithful to traditional Chinese beliefs, either Confucianism, ancestral worship, Buddhism, or Taoism, while others adhered to various ecclesiastical doctrines. The number of Chinese migrants who converted to Christianity remained at first low. They were mainly Protestants who had already been converted in China. For centuries, foreign Christian missionaries had strived to Christianize the nation with relatively minor success wholly. Christian missionaries had also worked in the Chinese communities and settlements in America. Still, nevertheless, their religious message found few who were receptive. It was estimated that during the first wave until the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, less than 20% of Chinese immigrants had accepted Christian teachings. Their difficulties with integration were exemplified by the end of the first wave in the mid-20th century, when only a minority of Chinese living in the US could speak English. Women who worked as prostitutes for foreigners also commonly kept a nursery of tanker girls, specifically to export them to overseas Chinese communities in Australia or America for prostitution work, or to serve as a Chinese or foreigner's concubine. Few were women of the first wave of Chinese who moved to America. In 1850, the Chinese community of San Francisco consisted of 4,018 men and only 7 women. By 1855, women made up only 2% of the Chinese population in the United States, and even by 1890, this had only increased to 4.8%. The lack of visibility of Chinese women, in general, was due partially to the cost of making the voyage, when there was a lack of work opportunities for Chinese women in America. This was exacerbated by the harsh working conditions and the traditional female responsibility of looking after the children and extended family back in China. The only women who did go to America were usually merchants' wives. Other cultural factors, such as having bound feet and not leaving home. Another important consideration was that most Chinese men were worried that by bringing their wives and raising families in America, they too would be subjected to the same racial violence and discrimination they had faced. With the heavily uneven gender ratio, prostitution increased, and the Chinese sex trade and trafficking became a lucrative business. Documents from the 1870 U.S. Census show that 61% of 3,536 Chinese women in California were classified as prostitutes as an occupation. Chinese prostitution was detected early, after which the police, legislature, and popular press singled out Chinese prostitutes for criticism. This was seen as further evidence of the depravity of the Chinese and the repression of women in their patriarchal cultural values. Laws passed by the California state legislature in 1866 to curb the brothels worked alongside missionary activity by the Methodist and Presbyterian churches to help reduce the number of Chinese prostitutes. By the 1880 U.S. Census, documents show that only 24% of 3,171 Chinese women in California were classified as prostitutes. Many married Chinese Christians and formed some of the earliest Chinese American families in mainland America. Nevertheless, American legislation used prostitution to make immigration far more difficult for Chinese women. On March 3, 1875, in Washington, D.C., the United States Congress enacted the Page Act that forbade the entry of all Chinese women considered obnoxious by representatives of U.S. consulates at their origins of departure. In effect, this led to American officials erroneously classifying many women as prostitutes, which significantly reduced the opportunities for all Chinese women wishing to enter the United States. After the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, many Chinese Americans immigrated to the southern states, particularly Arkansas, to work on plantations. The 10th U.S. Census of Louisiana showed that 57% of interracial marriages between these Chinese American men were to African American women, and 43% to European American women.
California Genocide. The California Genocide killed thousands of indigenous people of California by United States government agents and private citizens in the 19th century. It began following the American conquest of California from Mexico and the influx of settlers due to the California Gold Rush, which accelerated the decline of the indigenous population of California. Between 1846 and 1873, it is conservatively estimated that American settlers murdered some 9,500 California natives, and acts of enslavement, kidnapping, rape, child separation, and displacement were widespread. State authorities and militias encouraged, tolerated, and carried out these acts. The state of California used its institutions to favor white settlers' rights over indigenous rights, dispossessing natives. The 1925 book Handbook of the Indians of California estimated that the indigenous population of California decreased from perhaps as many as 150,000 in 1848 to 30,000 in 1870 and fell further to 16,000 in 1900. The decline was caused by disease, starvation, killings, and massacres. California Native Americans, particularly during the Gold Rush, were targeted in killings. Settlers between 10,000 and 27,000 Native Americans were also taken as forced labor. Since the 2000s, several American academics and activist organizations, both Native American and European American, have characterized the period immediately following the U.S. conquest of California. The state and federal governments waged genocide against the Native Americans in the territory. In 2019, California's Governor Gavin Newsom apologized for the genocide and called for a research group to better understand the topic and inform future generations. Before Spanish arrival, California was home to an indigenous population thought to have been as high as 300,000. The largest group was the Chumash people, with around 10,000. The region was highly diverse, with numerous distinct languages spoken. While there was great diversity in the area, archaeological findings show little evidence of intertribal conflicts. The various groups appear to have adapted to particular areas and territories. California habitats and climate supported an abundance of wildlife, including rabbits, deer, varieties of fish, fruit, roots, and acorns. The natives largely followed a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, moving around their area through the seasons as different types of food were available. California was one of the last regions in the Americas to be colonized. Spanish missionaries, led by Franciscan administrator Junípero Serra and military forces under Gaspar de Portola, did not reach this area until 1769. The Spanish built San Diego de Alcalá, the first of 21 missions, at what grew present-day San Diego in the southern part of the state along the Pacific. The mission was intended to spread the Christian faith among the region's indigenous peoples and establish places to develop area resources and products for the empire. The military constructed outposts alongside the missions to house the soldiers sent to protect the missionaries. Spanish and Mexican rule was devastating for native populations. Historians estimate that the pre-contact population was reduced by 33% during the Spanish and Mexican regimes. As the missions grew, California's native population of Indians began a catastrophic decline. Most of the deaths stemmed from imported diseases and the disruption of traditional ways of life, but violence was expected, and some historians have charged that life in the missions was close to slavery. In the latter half of the 19th century, California state and federal authorities incited, aided, and financed miners, settlers, ranchers, and people's militias to enslave, kidnap, murder, and exterminate a significant proportion of displaced Native Americans. The latter were sometimes contemptuously referred to as diggers for their practice of digging up roots to eat. Many of the same violence policies were used against the indigenous population as the United States had done throughout its territory. Simultaneous to the ongoing extermination, reports of the decimation of Native Americans were made to the rest of the United States and internationally. The California Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was enacted in 1850. This law provided for apprenticing or indenturing Indian children to whites and also punished vagrant Indians by hiring them out to the highest bidder at a public auction if the Indian could not provide sufficient bond or bail. This legalized a form of slavery in California. White settlers took 24,000 to 27,000 California Native Americans as forced laborers, including 4,000 to 7,000 children. Notable early eyewitness testimony and account, The Indians of California 1864, is from John Ross Brown, customs official and inspector of Indian Affairs. He systematically described the fraud, corruption, land theft, slavery, rape, and massacre perpetrated on a substantial portion of the Aboriginal population. Contemporary historians have documented the numbers of Californian Indians killed between 1846 and 1873. They estimate that during this period, at least 9,492 to 16,092 Californian Indians were killed by non-Indians. Most of the deaths took place in what he defined as more than 370 massacres.
Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is an anti-slavery novel by American author Harriet Beecher Stowe. Published in 2 volumes in 1852, the book had a profound effect on attitudes toward African Americans and slavery in the U.S. and is said to have helped lay the groundwork for the American Civil War. A Connecticut-born woman of English descent, Stowe was part of the religious Beecher family. A teacher at the Hartford Female Seminary, and an active abolitionist, she featured the character of Uncle Tom in the novel, a long-suffering enslaved black person around whom the stories of other characters revolve. The sentimental novel depicts the reality of slavery while also asserting that Christian love can overcome slavery. The title page illustrates a modest log cabin inhabited by a black family. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel, and the second best-selling book of the 19th century, following the Bible. It is credited with helping fuel the abolitionist cause in the 1850s. The first year after it was published, publishers sold 300,000 copies of the book in the United States, publishers sold 1 million copies in Great Britain. 8 power presses, running incessantly, could barely meet the demand. The impact attributed to the book is significant, reinforced by a story that when Abraham Lincoln met Stowe at the start of the Civil War, he declared, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." The quote is apocryphal, it did not appear in print until 1896, and it has been argued that the long-term durability of Lincoln's greeting as an anecdote in literary studies and Stowe scholarship can perhaps be explained in part by the desire among many contemporary intellectuals to affirm the role of literature as an agent of social change. The book and the plays it inspired helped popularize several stereotypes about black people. These include the affectionate, dark-skinned mammy, the pickaninny stereotype of black children, and the namesake character type of Uncle Tom, describing a dutiful, long-suffering servant faithful to his white master or mistress. In recent years, the negative associations with Uncle Tom's Cabin have, to an extent, overshadowed the historical impact of the book as a vital anti-slavery tool. Uncle Tom's Cabin is dominated by a single theme, the evil and immorality of slavery. While Stowe weaves other sub-themes throughout her text, such as the moral authority of motherhood and the redeeming possibilities offered by Christianity, she emphasizes the connections between these and the horrors of slavery. Stowe sometimes changed the story's voice to give a sermon on the destructive nature of slavery. One way Stowe showed the evil of slavery was how this peculiar institution forcibly separated families from each other. One of the sub-themes presented in the novel is temperance. Stowe made it somewhat subtle, and in some cases, she weaved it into events that would also support the dominant theme. Because Stowe saw motherhood as the ethical and structural model for American life and believed that only women had the moral authority to save the United States from the demon of slavery, Uncle Tom's Cabin's central theme is the moral power sanctity of women. Stowe's puritanical religious beliefs show up in the novel's final, overarching theme, the exploration of the nature of Christianity, and how she feels Christian theology is fundamentally incompatible with slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin outraged people in the American South. The novel was also roundly criticized by slavery supporters. Some called the story criminal and slanderous. Reactions ranged from a bookseller in Mobile, Alabama, being forced to leave town for selling the novel to threatening letters sent to Stowe, including a package containing an enslaved person's severed ear. Many Southern writers soon wrote their books in opposition to Stowe's novel. Some critics highlighted Stowe's lack of life experience relating to Southern life, which led her to create inaccurate descriptions of the region. For instance, she had never been to a Southern plantation. However, Stowe always said she based the characters of her book on stories runaway slaves told her in Cincinnati. It is reported that she observed firsthand several incidents which galvanized her to write the famous anti-slavery novel. Scenes she watched on the Ohio River, including seeing a husband and wife being sold apart, and newspaper and magazine accounts and interviews, contributed material to the emerging plot. In response to these criticisms, in 1853, Stowe published A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, an attempt to document the integrity of the novel's depiction of slavery. In the book, Stowe discusses each of the notable characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and cites real-life equivalents to them while also mounting a more aggressive attack on slavery in the South than the novel itself had. Like the novel, A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin was a bestseller. However, while Stowe claimed A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin documented her previously consulted sources, she read many of the cited works only after the publication of her novel. A significant part of the key was Stowe's critique of how the legal system supported slavery and licensed owners' mistreatment of enslaved people. Thus, Stowe put more than slavery on trial, she put the law on trial. This continued an essential theme of Uncle Tom's Cabin, that the shadow of law brooded over the institution of slavery, and allowed owners to mistreat enslaved people and then avoid punishment for their mistreatment. In some cases, as Stowe pointed out, it even prevented kind owners from freeing their slaves. Despite these criticisms, the novel still captured the imagination of many Americans. according to Stowe's son, when Abraham Lincoln met her in 1862. Since then, many writers have credited this novel with focusing Northern anger at the injustices of slavery and the fugitive slave law and helping to fuel the abolitionist movement. The novel's creation and use of common stereotypes about African Americans are significant because Uncle Tom's Cabin was the best-selling novel during the 19th century. Some modern scholars and readers have criticized the book for condescending racist descriptions of the black character's appearances, speech, and behavior and the passive nature of Uncle Tom in accepting his fate. As a result, the book, along with illustrations from the book and associated stage productions, was accused of playing a significant role in permanently ingraining such stereotypes into the American psyche. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Black Power and Black Arts movements attacked the novel, claiming that the character of Uncle Tom engaged in race betrayal and that Tom made slaves out to be worse than enslavers. Among the stereotypes of blacks in Uncle Tom's Cabin are the happy darky, the light-skinned tragic mulatto as a sex object, the affectionate, dark-skinned female mammy, the pickaninny stereotype of black children, the Uncle Tom, an African American who is too eager to please white people. Stowe intended Tom to be a noble hero and a Christ-like figure who, like Jesus at his crucifixion, forgives the people responsible for his death. These negative associations have to some extent obscured the historical impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin as a vital anti-slavery tool. In recent years, however, scholars have re-examined Uncle Tom's Cabin, stating that the book is a central document in American race relations and a significant moral and political exploration of the character of those relations.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.